What's up guys, this is Valentina with Bigger Creations, and today we're talking about the limiters inside of Logic Pro. There are two limiters we want to talk about inside of Logic Pro. First one is the regular limiter, and the second one is the adaptive limiter. I'll be honest with you, when I first started producing, I had no idea there was even a difference between these two. So I'm going to break it down for you guys and tell you exactly how each of them work and why you would use one over the other in which scenarios. So let's jump into it. So let's start with the adaptive limiter. The adaptive limiter is mostly used, especially in the mastering phase, to smooth and round out the peaks in your audio file. So what you're trying to do is basically increase the volume at which the entire project is without actually peaking. So let me break down when you pull up an adaptive limiter inside of Logic, what you're going to see and what each control means. Let's talk a little bit about what we see here in the adaptive limiter. So first off, you're going to see 3 meters here on the left side. The input is just the input, what you're actually playing back, and it will show you the level at which that's playing back. The reduction one will show you how much the limiter is actually reducing from that signal. So anything that's going over that threshold amount is being reduced. That will be indicated here. And then your output will show you your overall output level afterwards. So then here on the right side, we have the gain knob, which is basically a volume knob. And then you have the out ceiling, which is basically that threshold. So anything that is over -0.1 dB in this scenario is going to be automatically reduced or rounded. Now, the look ahead is basically how far in advance do you want the limiter to be analyzing your audio waveform to detect those peaks. But what I like to do is actually use the optimal look ahead time, which is indicated here to be 20 milliseconds. Remove DC offset is something that you'll use only if you've been recording with analog equipment where you're going to have some of those frequencies that need to be cut out. And true peak detection is just going to actually detect those true peaks in the waveform. So it'll make things a little bit more accurate when it comes to how it's limiting your audio file. Now, something you'll notice in contrast of using the adaptive limiter versus the normal limiter is that you're going to be introducing less noise and unwanted distortion in using the gain. Something to keep in mind with the gain, though, is that the more you raise this knob, the more dynamic range you are potentially losing. Because essentially, a limiter is a type of compressor. What it's doing is compressing those high peaks and bringing them down a little bit lower in a way where you can actually increase the gain in a less destructive way than a compressor. Before we jump into the limiter, I just want to thank today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by DistroKid. DistroKid is the easiest and fastest and most affordable way to get your music out there. So if you're looking to release your music on Spotify, Apple Music, Google Play, wherever digital stores and streaming services, DistroKid is the place to do it. And if you use the link in the description, you'll get 7% off. One of my favorite features of DistroKid is being able to use distro cards to promote my music instead of having to hire out a graphic designer or mess with Illustrator and Photoshop myself. I can easily get my artwork for the song that I'm trying to promote, and DistroKid has a bunch of templates and presets that you can use to then download and easily post on social media to promote your music right away. If you have music you're waiting to release, stop waiting, use DistroKid. It's the best way to do it. And if you use the link in the description, you'll get 7% off. Now let's talk about the limiter. Now, the limiter is a little bit different than the adaptive limiter. So like we talked about, the adaptive limiter is more about rounding and smoothing out those peaks in your audio file when it comes to volume. And in turn, also turning up the gain knob to help compensate for the volume, right? To get more perceived loudness and also just legit make it louder. Now, the regular limiter is a lot more like a hard compressor. What it's doing is basically anything that's over the threshold amount is not going to come through. So it acts a lot more like just a hard compressor. Basically at that threshold, nothing above that threshold will actually come through. Let's jump into the limiter and I'll show you some of the ins and outs of that one. So here we have our limiter, and you're gonna notice we have the same meters here. So we've got our input, our reduction, and our output. So we have a good idea of what's happening with our audio. We have a gain knob, same thing as the adaptive limiter. We have a release knob, which is a little bit different. Here, we're going to be able to basically, similar to just a regular compressor, we can decide how long it takes to release that limiting, that compression, once it's taken into effect after the peak has gone through the threshold. The output level Basically, you're always going to want this to be just below 0 dB. So usually I go either -0.1 or -0.2 just to make sure that literally nothing is going past the 0 mark. And then look ahead is just like the other. It's how far in advance you want the limiter to look at your peaks to be able to detect the compression that needs to happen. And then you'll notice that we have two different modes here. We have legacy and precision. Precision mode allows you to turn on true peak detection, which means it will actually look at the exact peaks more accurately. If you choose legacy, then it will be a little bit more similar to the knee knob in a compressor, where you can decide how smooth you want that transition to be on the limiting. Something to know here is basically all of these knobs are very similar to the adaptive limiter with the exception of the release knob. Now, the importance of the release knob is if you set the release time to be too long, then you're going to start feeling some of that pumping action, similar to when you add too aggressive of a compressor to you're going to notice it right away. If you put this too short, then you're going to start getting unwanted distortion. So in general, you'll want to be somewhere between 20 to 100 milliseconds. 100 milliseconds is kind of a good starting point for your release. Now, there are scenarios where you're going to want anything over that threshold to just not come through. And that's where you're going to want to use a limiter, where it's a little bit more aggressive and just completely slices that off. Now, I enjoy using the adaptive limiter a little bit more because it's less aggressive and gives you a little bit more leeway on how far you can push the gain, especially when you're talking about mastering. If you're interested in looking at how I use an adaptive limiter in my mastering chain, I'll link to the video where I talk about it up here, but you'll be able to see how essential this plugin is to that chain of mastering. So there you have it, guys. I hope that was helpful. Hopefully now you know exactly how to use a limiter and the adaptive limiter inside of Logic. If you like this video, make sure to hit that thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss future videos. And as always, if you ever have any questions or want to see more content, check me out on Instagram. Keep making beats.